Hi there. Let's talk about puberty. So, puberty is actually different from adolescence. Puberty describes the physical changes that are associated with our sexual maturation or becoming capable of reproducing. Adolescence, on the other hand, has to do with the psychological maturation of our sexuality. We're going to talk more about adolescence later on in this course. I just want to talk about the physical changes and what kicks those off in this video. So, puberty brings big physical changes. Puberty officially begins when menstruation or ejaculation first occur. However, there are physical changes that begin before that. One of the biggest changes that we can see is the change in height and weight, or the physical growth of the entire body. So that's significant and sometimes really fast. We also see a visible growth in the size of the genitals and secondary sex characteristics like breasts, and a general change in body size and shape. So, for instance, hips get wider in females and shoulders get wider in males. And this is also when we see changes in hair growth. So, hair starts to show on the face, in the armpits, and in the pubes. Puberty also increases the sensitivity of our genitals, and therefore we often see an increase in self touching or masturbation at this time. And finally, and this is the part I want to focus on next, is that we see a change in the brain development. There's enormous growth in the brain and a shift in terms of how it operates. And this has a big influence in how adolescence proceeds as we continue to develop, in addition to driving the physical changes. So, when does all this happen? Well, it's a range. So, it starts at different times for different people, and some of that's genetics. So, if your parents started puberty earlier, then you probably did too. If they were later, then probably the same was true for you. However, there's also a big component that has to do with our metabolism, which I'm going to touch on in the next slide. So, the physical changes actually start before we see menstruation and ejaculation. And when it starts is anytime between 8 and 14. So, that's a pretty huge range. That's a 6-year range. The average age for girls to start to get their first period is about 12. And the average age for boys to have their first ejaculation is around 14. But again, that range is very wide. So there is no like cutoff for when things are unnatural in some way or unusual. Puberty, or the physical changes, lasts on average 3 to 4 years. And interestingly, it starts about 3 years earlier than it did about 100 years ago. And similarly, during the pandemic, we saw a significant shift to earlier puberty. This has a lot to do with the metabolism, or how we store fat. One thing to keep in mind is that puberty by itself is already stressful. That is a lot of changes for our body and our brain to go through. Starting puberty significantly earlier or later than one's peers can lead to significant anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and possibly to unhealthy behaviors. So if and when you're in a position to support somebody who's going through this, keep that in mind. This is an age where we are very sensitive to how other people are developing, and there's a lot of comparison. And no matter how we compare, we usually come out below whoever we're comparing ourselves to. All right, so puberty starts when our bodies have the energy resources to support reproduction. We say that this is metabolically gated, and that's to prevent us from being fertile or being able to reproduce when energy resources are low. If we were to become reproductively viable, When there weren't enough resources, then our offspring would be unlikely to survive. So this is evolution's way of making sure that we're not making babies until our bodies can actually support the process. One of the things that helps our body to know whether we have the resources is this hormone called leptin. Leptin gauges the fat levels in our body. And so when leptin reaches a certain level, that indicates that we have enough fat stored to be able to handle reproduction, it allows or stimulates the production of this hormone called kisspeptin. Now, kisspeptin is what directs brain development. Okay, so it's not involved directly in changing our body. Its primary action is in the brain. And one of the things that it does is it lowers our aversion to sex. So that thing that we see in all kids when they're like, ew, kissing, or boys have cooties, that kind of thing, that's real. There is an actual aversion to sex that is in the child's brain. And when kisspeptin removes that, the interest in sex, the curiosity starts to increase. Now, I want to say just one thing about kisspeptin and why I have these Hershey's Kisses here. The group that discovered kisspeptin was working in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and they were actually looking at its role in cancer. And they decided to give it the name kisspeptin because Hershey is the home of the Hershey's Kiss. Only later did we discover that kisspeptin actually has a huge role in the development of our sexual anatomy and our adolescence, the psychology of our sexual development. All right, so let's look at what kisspeptin does. Kisspeptin, as the levels increase, it allows a part of our brain called the hypothalamus, which is this little triangle here or over here. You can see it. The hypothalamus then secretes something called gonadotropin releasing hormone. I know this is an atrocious name, but it's also telling you exactly what it does. So gonads are the testes or the ovaries. A tropin is something that stimulates them. So a gonadotropin stimulates the testes or ovaries. Now, this is a releasing hormone. So it's telling something else, another part of the brain, to release the gonadotropins. And that's exactly what we're going to see. So during infancy and childhood, GnRH secretion is inhibited by the brain. But with kisspeptin, the inhibition is removed and GnRH levels start to increase. GnRH is inhibited by a number of drugs, including opioids and even some antidepressants, particularly a class that are called the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Intense exercise. So you see this in athletes that are training for the Olympics, for instance, or extreme mental stress like anxiety or depression can also inhibit GnRH, which means that puberty will be postponed. Okay, so here's GnRH coming from the hypothalamus, and it's going to a region of the brain called the pituitary. Let me move my camera here. And you can see the pituitary over here. And this is what's going to do the next step. So GnRH is saying, hey, pituitary, release the gonadotropins. All right. So GnRH goes to the pituitary. The pituitary secretes two hormones, FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. We're going to see both of those in more detail when we talk about the reproductive cycles for males and females. In any case, both of these go to the gonads. Just so we're clear, FSH and LH go to the ovaries. Also, both hormones go to the testes, so it's not one or the other, and generally an individual does not have both. All right, so FSH and LH stimulate the testes and the ovaries to do a number of things, but one of them is to produce estrogen and testosterone. Estrogen and testosterone stimulate and direct the development of the visible sexual anatomy as well as the internal anatomy. Another thing that they do is they go back to the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus to tell the pituitary to make growth hormone. And growth hormone is what causes our body to become overall larger at this point. So, what happens in terms of the actual anatomy? We see changes in the primary sex organs, which are the ovaries and the testes. They actually become larger. We also see changes in the secondary sex organs, which are things like the penis and the uterus and the vulva. We also see secondary sex characteristics appear. So breasts become larger. Actually, this happens for boys as well as girls, especially as puberty is just getting started. There is a tenderness just under the areola that is typical. But then female secondary sex development causes a much more fat to be deposited in the breasts. We also get voice changes as the larynx becomes larger in males. The voice becomes deeper. We see changes in body shape with the hips and the shoulders, and also the appearance of hair in the pubic region, underarms, and on our faces. By the way, that hair is there for a reason. Even though in our society we tend to get rid of most of it, it's designed to transmit the scents that our body produces so that we attract partners that are also reproductively viable. In other words, it's supposed to announce that you're able to have babies or produce babies. So sort of like one of those diffusers that people put in their rooms to have an oil that makes the room smell good. That's what that hair is for. It's just that in our culture and in some other cultures, we're pretty funny about smells and we get rid of it. But that's why it's there. Now, all of this is leading to the development of our adult anatomy and physiology. Physiology is the function. In the next video, I'm going to start by talking about the male anatomy and then physiology, and then we're going to move into female anatomy and physiology. And I'm doing female after male because we're going to move from there into pregnancy and childbirth.